Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. And this week we're joined by Matthias Maurer. Hi Matthias, how are you?
Hello, Shemai. I'm very well. How are you?
Yeah, very good, thank you. Yeah, this week we're going to explore language teaching through the lens of Welsh as a second language in English medium primary schools. And I know that that's something that is very close to your heart. And at the risk of spending the whole episode talking about your backstory, I thought we'd begin with a little bit about who you are and how you got to where you are at the moment.
Hello. So I'm Matthias. As you probably have guessed by now, I grew up in Germany, where I studied the violin at music college after finishing school. And I came to Wales more than 20 years ago to play the violin in the Orchestra of Welsh National Opera. After about 10 years of doing this, I retrained as a primary teacher, and then I taught for a number of years in a rural English medium primary school in South Wales. During this time, I was really fortunate because I was offered a place on the Welsh sabbatical programme. And for a whole year, I then went on to Cardiff University, where I not only learned to speak Welsh, but also how to teach it effectively. Following the sabbatical year, I returned to my school and I specialized further in languages pedagogy and curriculum design. It's funny, but music is a language in its own, and so is Welsh, obviously. And I found many similarities between the two of them. And I think that's why I have developed this real love for teaching languages, because it allows me to communicate with the learners and the people I speak to in a way that's sometimes quite similar to communicating with your audience if you are a violinist and performing. So I specialized in this and was very interested in researching and introducing pedagogy that was used effectively across the world, really, for teaching international languages. About 2.5 years ago, I left school and took up my current role as education advisor for Welsh and English medium schools. And I now support the English medium schools in my region in South Wales with all aspects of teaching Welsh in curriculum for Wales.
I mean, you say that people might guess, but there are lots of, when you end your sentences, lots of Welsh sort of lilts in there. You know, I think perhaps more Welsh than whenever we met 20, well, not 20 years, 5 years ago or so. What do you reckon?
Yeah, that's quite funny because my daughter speaks about the time when I still used to have a German accent, and now she starts talking about my Welsh accent. I think it becomes because I have the privilege of traveling so much and working in so many schools in the Welsh valleys as well. I hear a lot of accents, and I do not put it on. It just happens. I learned this implicitly. We get to implicit learning later, but I really just do it because I've heard it so many times. So it's very interesting for me to observe myself every now and then.
Yeah, it's quite common with English. So maybe I notice it more with English. Wherever the person you learned from in the main or for a long period of time, you know, lots of people sound American because they had American tutors, or they'll sound very British because they British tutors. It's fascinating, and I think you know, just as fascinating as your backstory, and you know, Welsh. I see a lot of parallels with the Irish language, particularly in terms of its usage and the sort of systems in place to ensure the survival of essentially what are ancient Celtic dialects, so to speak. And I thought it might be interesting to begin with a picture of what it means to teach Welsh as a second language in an English medium primary school.
I will actually start by just speaking quickly about English medium and Welsh medium schools in Wales. There are nuances and categories, and we are revisiting all of this at the moment. But in the bone, Welsh medium primary schools teach Welsh through immersion. From the moment children enter school, they are immersed in the Welsh language. Welsh is the language of education. English becomes a subject at one point, but all other subjects are delivered through Welsh. English medium schools, which in my part of Wales are the majority of schools, but not in all other regions of Wales. In English medium schools, English is the main language of the school. And Welsh is taught as a subject, but not only as a subject. And that's a really important distinction because that's different to, let's say, the teaching of Spanish or French in a Scottish or an English primary school. Our aim in the English medium schools is to achieve a degree of bilingualism and bilingual school life. So Welsh is not restricted to our discrete lessons. Most schools will offer daily Welsh sessions on top of discrete weekly lessons. These daily Welsh sessions will last from 15 to 20 minutes. They consist of daily practice, where we introduce and practice new language patterns and revisit familiar patterns. It's very oracy based because the oracy is what we want to develop most in our younger learners. But building on this, then we also try and apply Welsh across the curriculum where it becomes very interesting. So we don't want to contain the Welsh just in the Welsh lessons and the Welsh sessions. A nice example how this can be done meaningfully is when you think about our young learners learning to talk about themselves. Yeah, so my name is Matthias. I am 7 years old and I live in Cardiff. So fy enw I ydy Matthias, dwi'n 7 oed, dwi'n byw yng Nghaerdydd. Once learners can say this, and then in their topic work, they learn, let's say, about the rainforest, for example, and they study rainforest animals. It's very easy to speak about the animals they have studied using the same language patterns and then revisit and transfer these patterns, which is very, very important in language learning. So it's great we have this opportunity. They might speak about the anaconda in the Amazon River and say, fy enw I ydy anaconda, dwi'n byw yn yr afon Amazon. And dwi'n hoffi bwyta bysgod. They might say they like eating fish. So there's a way of doing this meaningfully where the Welsh is not restricted just to the Welsh lessons. And that's a really nice aspect, I think, of our curriculum on the whole. On top of this, then, the big difference to most, I'd say, in schools in other countries where international languages are taught is that every teacher in our English medium primary schools teaches Welsh with very few exceptions. So it's the expectation for all teachers to have the Welsh they are teaching and to keep learning and developing themselves professionally. And that has many benefits because that brings them the opportunity to be present from the moment you enter school. You will hear Welsh and you will also see Welsh across the school when you enter it. So most displays, for example, are bilingual. Classroom displays as well will display current language patterns that children are learning. So it's very important then to think that it's not just the language we learn, but it's also the culture that comes with the language that we try to promote as well as possible in our English medium schools.
It sounds amazing. I mean, because if I think back to my own childhood, I think children in Ireland have greater opportunities, more opportunities to learn in Irish medium schools. Certainly in the part of Ireland that I grew up in, there were none when I was growing up, but there are now. And in the English medium schools, Irish was almost like a GCSE subject, and that was the limit to it. So what you're describing to me, sounds like this immersive experience where you have got almost like both options, and you can utilize them in very similar ways. And if you sort of put the effort in to similar levels of proficiency. Is it as ideal as it seems to me, or do you think there are steps that could be taken to go even further?
I think we can talk about the challenges to the system later on, once we've spoken about all the opportunities. One factor we need to keep in mind is that if we want to teach through immersion, there's a lot of research that shows clearly that a very high level of language competency is required from the practitioners. The situation on the ground in our English medium primary schools is that many teachers have limited Welsh language skills. Some, like myself, have been very lucky to go through the training and learn the language to be mostly fluent. So immersion is not in all situations the best way forward. It can be part of the picture, but certainly not the whole picture. Also because to teach immersion properly, you need a lot of contact time, yet we deliver our curriculum mostly through English. So this doesn't quite match up. So this is why we need and we have a special approach for Welsh and English medium schools that might use some immersion elements, but also draws strongly on elements of direct instruction and just effective second language pedagogy, with the added bonus then that we can use the Welsh and apply in practice, not just in the Welsh lessons, but throughout the curriculum and across the day.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'd be a big fan of that approach too. I use the term immersion carelessly because, I know it's an actual pedagogical approach, isn't it? And particularly on YouTube, where people will put themselves and say, I've lived in this country for 3 months and now I can speak the language. And we know it's a bit more difficult than that.
Immersion is certainly the most effective way to learn a language. There's no doubt about it, for young children especially. But it has a lot to do with the expertise and the language skills of the teacher and the contact time they have in there. And that's just sometimes not realistic in our English medium primary schools.
Maybe 4 or 5 generations from now, perhaps.
Absolutely, yes. So absolutely. I think I mentioned briefly that we are at the moment rethinking the way we categorize schools. So we want to move our schools in Wales across a continuum from English medium, some schools to dual language schools to Welsh medium schools, and schools can move from category to category when they are ready. So that is the long-term aim, and we are working towards like 2050, so 1 million speakers. That's our aim by 2050, and recategorizing the school system this way is done with the intent to encourage schools to move along and to include more and more Welsh in the teaching.
What does research into second language acquisition tell us about how primary age children learn languages? And how does that shape your approach to teaching Welsh?
Start with the general principles of how younger children acquire languages are similar to the way that older children and even adults learn languages. And any effective pedagogical approach must be rooted in these second language acquisition principles. So it's very important to understand this. I will also say there is no consensus in the research about what exactly they are. So it's a question of reading, knowing your context, making best bets. Of course, then younger learners have their own characteristics and limitations in some ways, and it's important to be aware of these so we can adapt our approach. For example, encoding knowledge and long-term memory is slower for younger learners, and also while older learners and adults can keep between 4 and 7 new items in the working memory, younger learners can often not hold more than 4. So it's very, very important to adapt the teaching to what the young children are able to do. Now, just said, second language acquisition is a wide field, and for many aspects, there is no really consensus regarding both the process of how we acquire languages and also of what that then means in terms of the most effective pedagogical approaches. However, there's one of them in particular I personally find really helpful, and that's Rod Ellis. Rod Ellis is a British linguist who currently is a research professor in the School of Education at Curtin University in Perth in Australia. Enormously helpful for practitioners like myself who want to make evidence-informed pedagogical choices and identify the best bets for their context. So I thought maybe starting by looking at some of Ellis's principles of instructed language learning might be a really good starting point to look at what our best bets might be for the teaching of languages to younger learners. So principle number 1, instruction needs to ensure that learners develop both a rich repertoire of formulaic expressions and a rule-based competence. And that's taken from Kieran. So he talks about expressions which cater to fluency. And rule-based competence consisting of knowledge of specific grammatical rules, which cater to complexity and accuracy. Really has affected how I personally think about language curriculum and about how we teach this curriculum once we've planned it. Of course, it's really important for young children, for young learners, for all learners to have a rich repertoire of formulaic expressions, so just phrases really they know and use. You do that, I do that a lot. That's a lot of how I learned English once I came here, because my English was sort of slightly dodgy when I arrived playing the violin. You pick up things and you reuse them, even if you can't manipulate them. So in our English medium schools, for example, young learners quickly learn to talk about themselves. They can use a range of formulaic expressions like doing hapus, yeah, I'm happy, doing saith I'm 7 years old, and even things like gai vindir tibach os gwelwch yn da, which means, can I go to the toilet, please? Very important, yeah? And most of them can send that fluently early on in their learning. So fluency is absolutely possible if we give learners enough time to practice. So why I think Ellis and Kieran are so spot on, though, is that they point out that we need to not just have a knowledge of these sort of catchphrases, yeah, formulaic expressions, but also think about developing grammatical knowledge alongside. And that, I think, is a challenge for many teachers if they are not specialists. And even for specialists, it's important to understand what exactly do we mean by grammatical knowledge and what's the purpose of this. My view on this has really been informed by my own experience, both as a teacher and as an advisor. I work with many teachers in the region. And in my experience, if we do not develop learners' understanding of specific grammatical rules, and that can be implicit or explicit, we'll get to that later, then the ability to manipulate and adapt familiar patterns remains really limited. And as a result, the language they know is somewhat disjointed. It's a bit like building up a stockpile of catchphrases, but you can't really adapt them. You can't really use them in different contexts because they don't understand how they are made, what they have to change to say something slightly different with it. So they can't apply them with new vocabulary, for example, or they can't turn a positive sentence, a confirmative sentence, into a negative statement. So that's what we mean by grammar in the first place, to have that understanding how you manipulate these sentences. So, for example, I mentioned going to the toilet, and we come back to that quite a lot because it's a good one. So, "Ga i fynd i'r tŷ bach" means, can I go to the toilet? If we do not teach the children what that phrase is made of at one point, they will only be able to say this, can I go to the toilet, but not, can I go to play? Can I go to the hall? Can I go home? Because they don't even understand what words do I change to change the meaning of that sentence. So that's why it's so important to go beyond just learning set phrases, but learn to manipulate them. And to do this, we need to build that inherent grammatical knowledge. And that's what Ellis is really on about, so we mustn't neglect that. But it's really important we do that in a child-friendly way and in a way that builds on what we know about how grammar is also learned. I'll talk about it a little bit later because Ellis comes back to this. But that's the bone of everything, really, I think, to find the right pedagogical approach that allows us to build these really strong foundations in second language learners.
It feels like that's particularly important in a language like Welsh, which I'm assuming will have similar grammatical constructs to Irish, things like declension, which aren't immediately obvious unless you are using them regularly and have that experience of them. Is that a fair characterization? So whenever these novice teachers are engaging with the language, it actually gets quite complex grammatically quite quickly. Would that be true?
Well, it's not the first language I learned, and personally, I found Welsh grammar logic, but it is, as we say, linguistically more removed from English than, say, French or German. Yeah. So, but the rules are pretty straightforward. There's just many of them, okay? But the point really is, and we come to this, what we mean by grammatical knowledge is not always the ability to verbalize a rule and to explain it in detail and apply it like a mathematical formula. It's more about knowing what sounds right and having enough of a mental representation of what you're going to say because you've heard it so many times. Like, I know there are probably Irish first language speakers, as there are many Welsh first language speakers, who are not able to explain any grammar to us, and yet they constantly use the right mutations in Welsh, which is quite a challenge for learners, for example. And the challenges you just mentioned in speaking Irish, because they have that implicit knowledge that is very important, more important in some ways than to be able to verbalize the rule. Ellis then goes on to talk about, in the second principle, that instruction needs to ensure that learners focus predominantly on meaning. That's another really important point. I think even more important for younger learners. We can play all the nice language games we want and have loads of fun. If there is not real, meaningful communication involved, does the acquisition really happen? Or do we just learn to play nice games? And I will not allude to any possible language apps that are around in this world, but we need to be aware that the aim is communication. And there is research and there are writers who will say that through communication do we really build up that knowledge and that ability to use the language. He also speaks about developing fluency based on the Kaiser, who speaks a lot about practicing to develop fluency, but also that developing fluency is based on many opportunities to create pragmatic meaning. So the best example is "Ga i fynd i'r tŷ bach," because every child in Wales can say, "Can I go to the toilet, please?" "Ga i fynd i'r tŷ bach" fluently. So because we've used it so many times, every day, every child asks this question. So it's a meaningful situation, and they're able to use this language meaningful in that situation. So it's very important to think about when we plan our curricula and teach, do we give enough opportunities to practice what we teach in a meaningful context where the meaning matters to the children? And that's the most important bit. Does it matter to the children? I once taught a certain language pattern only in the context of camping as a very new teacher, and we were excellent talking about camping until I realized that one of 30 children had ever been camping, and all of the others spoke beautifully about something they hadn't really any meaningful relation to. I felt very bad, and I still feel bad about this, because we need to make sure we give children the ability to communicate in contexts that matter to them and where they can reuse the language on an everyday basis. And that leads really to the last point then, where Ellis says that engaging learners in activities where they are focused on creating meaning is intrinsically motivating. And that's a really big thing for me. I'm a primary teacher. We do use stickers. I put my hand up. I have used stickers in my past, and we need extrinsic motivation at times, but it's that intrinsic motivation of being able to communicate meaningfully and doing something you couldn't do last year or last month or last week. That really helps learners and children to identify themselves as, yes, I can learn Welsh. To be honest, probably with every language, but with Welsh, in our case, if there's one thing I want children to take out of primary into secondary school is the absolute belief in themselves. Yes, I can learn this language. I am a language learner. So that's the most important bit. And this satisfaction comes not from being good at playing games and winning in games and against apps, whatever. It comes from having meaningful, emotional, connected conversations and little exchange of language with other people in your school, peers and adults alike.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think languages are up there with mathematics in terms of people have this innate sense that you can either do it or you can't. But really, it's just if you want it enough and if you work hard enough and you're motivated enough, then there's no language that's off limits. Even something like Hungarian, which is notoriously difficult for a European language.
Yes, so I've heard, yeah. Yeah, so that's a really interesting point. Because we aim to develop bilingualism in our schools, including English medium schools, we aim to teach the Welsh language patterns and the vocabulary that the children can use outside the Welsh as well. And by the way, it's not just the children, it's the teachers as well. I mentioned earlier, not all our teachers have been lucky enough to be able to access all the training I've been able to access, for example. There's much on offer, but not everyone is a specialist. So it's giving teachers and children in some ways the means to teach and learn the language together they can then use throughout the day. For example, asking a learner what they'd like for lunch or what they want to do at playtime, or of course, children asking to go to the toilet. These are language patterns. What do you want to do? What would you like to have? That we teach, but we can teach them in the context of activities where they then can be used. So that's very important to think about this, the context and the vocabulary. So in Principle 3, Alice then talks about that instruction needs to ensure that learners also focus on form. And this is about, among other things, building up grammatical knowledge. And that's the point, I think, where I learned most from Alice and consequently from Franco Conti, who is a language speaker, educator, academic, who's dedicated his life to improving the teaching of international languages. He's a very productive blogger. In one of his latest blogs, Franco writes about its exposure and processing of specific grammatical structures creates a sort of a neural trace. When we repeatedly hear the same structure, it gets embedded, a kind of a mental echo. And learners find it much easier to use a grammatical structure once the ground is prepared this way. And that's really important, because what that means is we need to give loads of input, but not just any language input, not just immersion or exposure, but very targeted input aimed at embedding this grammatical structure that we want them to learn. So, and then with young learners in particular, it's really important to provide as many opportunities as possible to process that language so they are already familiar with it by the time we then explain the rules explicitly. Conti will say, and I agree, it's not even possible at points to explain rules and help them to be able to verbalize a rule, but they need to be aware of this rule. And, as long as they're exposed enough to certain grammatical structures, children will pick these up and they will learn to manipulate them, young children in particular. By the way, it's completely possible to speak a language with hardly any declarative grammatical knowledge. Yeah, so we can't verbalize. We just spoke about this. So there are many Welsh first language speakers I know who are perfect with limitations. When I asked them then, so why did you say mein ddiddorol? I thought the word is ddiddorol, yeah? And how do you know it's mein wych? So it's great, not gwych. They say, I'm not quite sure. It just sounds right. Yeah, they literally say, it just sounds right. So that's because, why does it sound right? Because they've heard it in so many contexts, so often throughout their lives. So we cannot immerse the children in Welsh, but we can focus on key structures and key features, and then have this focused input and give them many opportunities to process these patterns. Ellison talks about this. So he talks about instruction needs to be predominantly directed at developing implicit knowledge of the second language while not neglecting explicit knowledge. And that's the bone really of everything. So the concept of implicit knowledge and the pedagogy to achieve this is one of the pillars of Gianfranco Conti's extensive processing instruction approach. I use many elements of EPI in my own practice, so extensive processing instruction, EPI, and also when I advise other teachers, because it provides a very clear and sequenced approach to first creating this implicit knowledge and then building on it, and adding to learners towards increasing the independent use of the language. I think the one thing that helped me the most personally to develop as a language teacher, and also that makes the biggest impact in my work with teachers who I support, developing their practice, is to get a clear understanding of what explicit knowledge is and what implicit knowledge is in teaching languages and how we acquire the both. So explicit knowledge is declarative. Yeah, so I know how I do mutations. I know there are certain consonants that change in Welsh in certain conditions. They are pekete, that's them. And they change in certain grammatical situations. Or if they are preceded by a certain other word, it's fun actually. I like it. These I had consciously. I just recited this to you. I could recite this really early on when I was learning Welsh, and I could verbalize the rule. I could explain what the rule is. However, this does not mean that I even now mutate correctly when I talk fast and without thinking in a real life situation. I get it right a lot, but not all the time. Yeah, so being able to verbalize a rule is not really enough to use a rule effectively. And we must not make the mistake, but I certainly made that previously in my professional life, pre-training and reading and learning, that knowing the rule is enough to apply it and speak using this rule. Like in mathematics, you would rule, the rule to find for quadratic equations, you apply this rule and you get your answer. Languages are differently, because explicit knowledge we do not use for speaking. We use implicit knowledge, procedural knowledge, where we don't even have to think about, we just do it. It's like when you get on a bike, you don't think about how I balance, turn the paddles. You have the feeling what is right, and that's what you do. So implicit knowledge is procedural. We hold it unconsciously and we can't explain it, we can't verbalize it. But yet that's what is required for rapid and fluent communication. This is what you have in your mother tongue. Yeah. So we all used, well, you did, I didn't. You used correct English grammar when you grew up, I hope, mostly. I certainly didn't, but I used correct German grammar because it was our mother tongue. It was modeled to us. We couldn't explain the rules when we were little, but we would use the right constructions. Only once we've done this a lot are we in a position then to use the language patterns we've learned implicitly in our own speech. I ask you to take part in a little experiment. And there's a nice little exercise we can demonstrate the power of implicit learning, or what it's like. Because listeners might just think, what is he talking about? We all have lots of implicit knowledge, things we learn without trying to learn them, just because we heard them so many. So if I could please ask you to just finish the sentences I say now with the first word that comes to your mind. Yeah? All the king's horses and all the king's
man.
Oh, what fun it is to ride on a one-horse open
sleigh.
One small step for man, one giant leap for
mankind.
Fantastic. Pedagogy, pedagogy, excellent. So did you at any point in your life sit down and think, oh, I really, really need to learn these. I need to learn these quotes, or did you just happen to know them?
No, I've never studied those before. I just know them.
Yeah, because you heard it so often times. You heard the nursery rhymes, you sang the songs, and we can't escape far too many people quoting Neil Armstrong. So, and then in Conti's EPI approach, in much of what I do and recommend schools to use is we use this element of receptive processing, where they shouldn't hear the language so often that they can't help but learn it.
How do you strike a balance between language exposure and direct instruction in the classroom?
So, it's a very interesting question. I think it depends on how we define exposure. As I said now, so one big step of learning a language is to give these modeling opportunities, processing opportunities. In order for this to work, we need to have controlled input, where the language children hear is at least 95. Conti would say, I think, at least 97% comprehensible input. So most languages familiar, a few new words, and this way we can learn through processing. And research indicates, and there are some authors like Krashen who are very strong on this, not just for, for all languages, not just your first language, who would say that anything below 95% in terms of input does not really further the language learning. So if we talk about exposure, I would say controlled input with target language works very well in very well-defined activities where the children are forced to process the language. And that preempts the speaking. I will not go into these details then, but of course, at one point you need to then start think about how you get the language out. So direct instruction is really important. I would define direct instruction in language teaching as including the modeling and using focused input to force the children to process language, different elements of the language in different ways. So the EPI approach, one element of this is that you have many different task activities focusing on the same pattern and repeatedly asking learners to process this, once focusing on word order, then on listening for mistakes, then listening on pronunciation, listening for meaning, but it's the same target pattern. That works very well. Exposure is also important, but maybe in the sense I understand it, in being immersed in the language environment. And that's absolutely vital, I'd say, because it's not enough to just teach the language. It's one of the great joys of being a language teacher that you can't avoid teaching about the culture and bringing in that raised level of cultural awareness that you just can't achieve without learning the language. I've learned that myself. When I came to Wales, I didn't speak Welsh. I made many friends. The Welsh people are very friendly. Many of them native speakers, so Welsh speakers as their mother tongue. Yet we spoke English because I didn't understand the word of Welsh. Once I learned Welsh and I spoke to these people, it's like doors opened to me because I learned more about the people. People are different in their mother tongue. And I also learned a lot more about Wales, the society I live in. It's like doors just opened to me. So it's very important learning a language, you realize it doesn't just open the door to the language, it opens the door to a whole part of culture and society that you won't experience the same way if you don't speak the language. To summarize, then I think exposure to original language content and authentic Welsh language context is vital to raise the status of the language and also that to feel and develop that cultural curiosity we want in our learners, and also to build an emotional connection to the language that goes further to maybe what you can achieve just through teaching it directly. Listening to original music, for example, in the target language is a good example of exposure that raises cultural awareness in a way that's hard to achieve through direct teaching only. However, for the learning, I think a very methodical pedagogical approach that's based on what we know, how we learn languages, and uses, evidence-informed practices, sequencing the learning from modeling over practicing to applying then the language patterns is vital. So the teacher leads a lot of this. And then in our approaches, once the children are more confident, it goes on to more independent practice, to partner practice. But in the early stages, definitely the teacher is very important to model and to teach.
It's almost like a really good example of the novice expert continuum and the reverse expertise effect in the more expert in a language you become, the less effective that direct instruction is going to be. But the more novice you are, the more essential it's going to be, isn't it, really? I mean, that's how I've always imagined it.
Yes. Yeah. And we need to keep in mind that in our primary schools, the children are beginners. So, and possibly learning a language takes more time than learning many other things in life. So there is a very interesting curve that Conti also often shows when he trains teachers. It's called the power curve of learning, and it shows the relationship between the amount of times you process or react to a language item and the reaction time you have to, to react or to produce that language in the situation. So when you encounter something the first time that you just learned, it takes a long time. And then over time, reaction times gets reduced to, under a second at one point. And quite often we stop them. We think, oh, that's mastery. We have achieved this. The children pretty good at, remembering how to say certain things. However, real fluency and automaticity, what we want, using a language without thinking, and, gái vind die bar, without thinking, can I go to the toilet? Only happens after many more repetitions. I think a number might be 60 to 80 encounters in meaningful situations, which is a lot. And it can take weeks, months, for some things maybe years, to use things, to come to the point where you use language spontaneously and automatically. So we need to keep that in mind in languages curricula, that we build in these recycling opportunities over a long amount of time. So, you might be able to learn your times tables quicker than you're able to learn, the future tense in Welsh in negative sentences, for example. You know it, you can use it, but it's about using it in speech without thinking about it. That's the hard bit then.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that generation of language that you were talking about in the middle. I've heard people say, like, describe it, you have almost like a different personality in different languages, and obviously you've got quite a few languages under your belt. So I don't know if you recognize those different personalities in yourself.
I might get my wife in now, and she can tell you about German Matthias and English Matthias and Welsh Matthias, and she doesn't even know French Matthias. Yeah, so there's a lot in this, absolutely. I'm a different person in every language, and so are the people I know. So I mentioned just a minute ago, friends I have who I met through English, and when I was able to speak Welsh with them, I discovered so much more to them, or just a different side to them. So there's absolutely this element, yeah. And it's lovely in children when they learn to use the Welsh meaningfully, and walk up to adults in the school and say, so in Welsh, yeah, so who are you and where do you live and how old are you? And they get that communication in Welsh going. It's fantastic, yeah, it's this really great thing. I also taught German for a while in my school, and that was special. So reception children asking me in the morning, wie geht's? Yeah, wie geht es dir? Wie heißt du? Wie alt bist du? Absolutely brilliant. Yeah, so there is something that tugs on your heartstrings when a young child learns your own mother tongue. That's why I sort of really want all our children to learn Welsh and speak it as good as they can, because it's such a connecting element to everyone around them. And there are Welsh speakers around, Welsh is spoken by a good proportion of the Welsh society. So it's very, very important to not just keep it alive, but develop it and give everyone the chance to use it in meaningful situations when they feel they need it.
Yeah, 100%. And touch wood, it'll be thriving by the time we get to 2050, and then we've got to have our Cymru 2070 plan in action. Are there particular challenges or opportunities unique to teaching a national language as a second language, compared to, for instance, German or another international language in your school?
Yes, I think there are many opportunities. Yeah, the status of the language is just different. It's a national priority, and Welsh language and culture have a value that the children pick up through everything we do around the Welsh language in schools. It's our job to sell this. Yeah, that's important. But we also have a lot of support, because as a nation, we want to move towards a bilingual and possibly multilingual Wales. So, for example, the expectation that every teacher speaks and teaches Welsh in our English medium primary schools is quite special. And that's mostly a massive opportunity, because it then opens up the opportunities to use Welsh across the day, and it's not restricted just to your weekly or, maybe your weekly Spanish lesson when the Spanish teacher comes in, or the German lesson when Matthias comes in to do the German. So because you can recycle the Welsh often, you've done it in your Welsh lesson, you can use it on the yard, you can use it dinner time, you can use it to open your maths lesson, no problem at all. Also, there are many opportunities for teachers to develop their Welsh skills and the teaching skills. There are free courses on different levels of different lengths provided by the National Centre for Learning Welsh. We have the Welsh sabbatical scheme, where I was able to take part, where you go away to Cardiff University for a term or 2 terms to be really immersed in language learning and also learning how to teach the language. So that's a real benefit that there's so much support then. The other nice thing is that there's a lot of support for schools to develop aspects of Welsh language culture and to get the children immersed in these. Most schools in Wales follow a scheme called the Cymraeg Campus Chatariaeth, where we develop the appreciation of the language and culture in all aspects of school life. We usually have a Grŵp Cymraeg, so that's a group of children across the school who, together with the teacher, work in promoting and then developing and deciding which aspects of Welsh they want to develop to the school, and they get a real stake in this, and it's been very, very successful. So that's great. You have all this support and a mandate to go beyond just teaching a language. And I think this is something some colleagues listening now who teach international languages might be jealous of, because it can be a challenge sometimes to teach international language when your learners don't really see the reason to do that or don't have the same cultural buy-in. Conte speaks a lot about the need when you design your language curriculum to think about your community and your context, because you might come from a community where all the parents take the children to France every summer for the holiday. They all know why it's important to learn French. They all want to learn French. You can go to teach the language, and you might work in a school, where no one ever has the money to leave the country. Many children don't leave. They are part of the village for most of the year. So there, your curriculum will have to depend much more on building up that cultural knowledge, that cultural awareness, and that love for the culture that needs to go hand in hand with learning the language. Because it's our national priority, that cultural aspect is just present in all aspects of our school life, and there's a lot of support to develop that further. Challenges. Yes, we want to use it whenever we can at school, but not all teachers are specialists. And sometimes I think we can forget this, especially as people who have learned Welsh and speak Welsh well. We might be tempted sometimes to forget how hard it is to teach something you are not confident in. If you think of the primary curriculum, most things we teach, we are very confident in, and if we are not, we can upskill ourselves quite quickly. It's not that easy to upskill yourself quickly in the Welsh language to achieve a level that's a lot higher in terms of proficiency than your learners if they've gone through school from nursery up to year 6. So that's really important that we think in terms of expectations, but support provided in particular, and training provided, professional learning provided, to address all these different levels of languages proficiency, but also pedagogical knowledge, because that's the other thing. Teaching a language is the best, as I would say, obviously, but it's also quite a specialized skill. I mentioned, the difference between explicit, implicit knowledge, all these things you need to know, and then you need to know how to address them in your teaching. So we must be careful to provide support for all teachers to do this. I think we're on the right track in Wales, but there's still a lot more to do till we come to 2050.
It all goes back to culture, doesn't it? And that understanding why. And I think, especially for younger learners, some of them are only just realizing where they are relative to their homes. My home is normally your foundation stage first topic, realizing that you're part of this community. So then to look at that abstract community, sometimes hundreds, if not thousands of miles away it can be a challenge, but I can see how, it feels like the opportunities outweigh the challenges in this situation. And it feels like with the right support, lots of those teachers can get their level of proficiency up. Certainly whenever I've spoken to teachers in Wales and they've been learning Welsh, they've been really enthusiastic about the, I think in Carmarthenshire they were insisting that they could take the materials and make sure they were interpreted for those people who needed them and that kind of thing. So, it feels like the opportunities are outweighing the challenges at the moment.
I have to say, I'm hugely impressed by our teachers, and I'm very proud of our schools, to be honest. And I have the suspicion that international languages teachers would find it very interesting to visit one of our English-medium primary schools, because it's such a focus for us. We have developed approaches that I dare say work very well in many schools. And just because we bring all together, not just the effective pedagogy, but also the cultural development, the cultural enrichment. So I think, personally, we are doing pretty well.
That ties perfectly into my next question. Are there any messages or sort of lessons from the teaching of Welsh in the context that would be most applicable to international language teaching? Is that the main takeaway for them?
Yeah, so it's difficult because I have only taught Welsh and a bit of German and a bit of French actually in Welsh primary school. So I don't quite know the context. But going from myself, where my learning curve was the steepest and what makes the biggest impact supporting colleagues in our schools, not just with teaching of Welsh, but French and German as well. There's two things that stand out. It goes back to what I said about Rod Ellis' work and the principles of instructed language learning. It has to be relevant to the children. So the language we teach has to be relevant to them. The context has to be relevant, and it has to be matched to their communicative needs. So you speak, for example, about you learn about yourself and your family when you're very young, your local community. So in terms of language, what are the needs where you can use the language meaningfully with the children and start there by teaching it? So many schools now made the choice to not teach the patterns of I have this, I have that in the context of camping or even family, because in school, you don't ask the children every day, do you have a brother, do you have a sister, or do you have a tent? But you ask them every single day, do you have a pencil? Or, primary school children, Mr. Maurer, I don't have a pencil. So there's a chance, meaningful to say, do ist den Pencil, götter wie, every single day. So it's very important when we choose to introduce structures and patterns, where's the context where it matters, where we can keep using them so it's authentic and meaningful to them. That's the one thing in terms of language planning. In terms of the teaching, without any doubt, then it is the principle of implicit knowledge, implicit learning, that I was not aware enough of when I started teaching, and that's made the biggest difference for me. Many schools use EPI or EPI-related approaches across the world really now in teaching primary languages as well. Where this happens, I think there's already a huge focus on receptive processing, so on having these activities where the children are really accountable, but in a fun and child-friendly way to follow the language, to process it, read it, hear it many, many times over before we go then on to have them practice speaking, have them practice writing. So it's that pedagogical approach, and that's, that would be another podcast to go into the details of this. That's made the biggest difference, because I, as a rookie teacher, thought, well, I've read the language, you said it back to me, now you go and use it. But it just doesn't work this way. It's not giving a formula and now you apply it. There's a long passage in between. For our listeners, I made this, the power curve of learning on the screen just now, where we need these 60 to 80 repetitions where, until we are really fluent and eventually, hopefully, spontaneous in using the language.
Absolutely. I mean, what's come to mind here, I've got a German textbook on my shelf. I won't say the name of it, but I remember doing like a comprehension exercise in it where it was like a monastery in Bavaria, and it was the person who was central to the textbook had gone on a trip, and I remember it being a really painful, slow process because I'm not one for visiting Bavarian monasteries that often, so that was come to my mind there when I'm thinking, actually, yeah, we can make this a whole lot more relevant.
You should definitely go.
Yeah, I mean, I probably would like it. Just didn't.
It's
like
got a German beer originated, isn't it?
If you could change one thing about how languages are introduced and taught in primary schools more broadly, what would it be and why? So, for instance, you became Minister for Languages and Culture.
That's no ambition of mine. It's mostly what I said in the last question, really. So it is about developing teacher expertise and knowledge, and also then providing resources that meet teachers where they are, because we'd always have, in ways now, different levels of expertise. And myself, I can resource everything I do. That's not a problem. Many people, even if it's sabbatical, can. But other teachers really benefit from worked examples of very good planning, very good resources, as at least initial models before then learning to support themselves further. So I think that's one thing. And the other thing, in an idea world, which we unfortunately don't live in, I would send everyone to a Welsh sabbatical year where they learn Welsh for a year and how to teach Welsh for a year, because that's by far the most important thing you can do is upskilling your teachers. We sometimes look at other countries. In the Basque country, we have a country that managed to move completely to Basque language education, nearly the whole country. It's a very different context, of course. Yeah, I won't go into this, but happening to be one of the richest parts of Spain, many teachers over a period of 10 years, then many teachers would go for 3 years of language learning and learning the pedagogy to teach Basque. We can't do this in Wales. Our context is different. I understand this, but the point stands that it's teacher expertise that makes the biggest difference.
You can see all these parallels between the languages across the Iberian Peninsula and up into the countries around France and what would have been Gaul, and then over into the
yeah. So interestingly, Bretagne is the language, the Celtic language closest to Welsh. So, and there are similarities. And I must say, Welsh is celebrated among many minority languages about the success we've had so far in, not just maintaining, but reversing the trend at times. It's a difficult subject, and one thing we also know, and Welsh government actually excellent in addressing this, is it's not enough to teach just the language. It's really important to create the opportunities and the fertile ground around school, across society, in every aspect of society. Otherwise, you have children who leave school and do not use the Welsh again. So, yes, but we know this, and we're working on it.
I mean, this has been absolutely fascinating, and I can't wait to line up the next one. You've already sort of started alluding to where we could go to next with this. I think it's be really useful, both for our listeners in Wales who are thinking about their own practice, and also anyone who is teaching a modern foreign language. I think it'd be massively useful. Now, you're going to join us in Cardiff on the 27th of September. Is that still right?
Yes, that's still right. Yes, I'm looking very much forward to it.
And tickets are definitely on sale now. I'm almost sort of highlighting whenever I'm speaking to people who are also going to be speaking at the conference. So tickets are available now. I'll make sure I put a link in the description. What are you going to be talking about, Matthias?
I will be talking about pedagogy. I'll be talking about things I pointed out today, but in a slightly deeper way with a lot more examples and practical examples, because I said one more time, it's developing teacher expertise that makes the biggest difference. And there are quick gains to be made. Yeah, there really are. Once we understand how we learn languages and how pedagogy can take advantage of this, we can have a real impact in our classroom. So I will look at our approach that I use as an advisor that's based on Conti's EPI, but slightly modified, simplified for first of our primary context, but also then for our sometimes non-specialist teachers.
Oh, fantastic. So almost like an expanded response to question 2. I'm definitely going to try and check that out. Normally I'm running around making sure everything's run smoothly, but if I want to go for it. We could have spent an hour on that easily.
You might have noticed I cut question 2 short.
Oh, that's fantastic. All that's left to do is say thank you very much for joining me. It's been a pleasure.
You're welcome. It's been an absolute pleasure to join you.
And everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.
Diolch yn fawr iawn.